Welcome to Selling Secrets, the show about action movies and spy films. Our mission is to look at the movies we love and go behind the scenes of what makes a successful action film. Each episode, we'll take a deep dive into the filmmaking process, the marketing of Hollywood, and more. Do you know what it takes to make a Hollywood blockbuster successful? Let's find out together on Selling Secrets. Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay. On today's episode, it's the first of my new format in which I interview experts in their field, whether that field be marketing or something outside of marketing entirely, and we talk about action films, spy films, and everything in between. Something that I've been wanting to discuss on this podcast for quite a while now is representation in films and Hollywood, and especially queer representation in film. As a straight, white, cisgendered man, I understand the privileged lens that I do look at life through due to my life experiences. So I wanted to bring on a guest today who is an expert in the field of queer representation. My guest is David Lowbridge-Ellis, the creator of the License to Queer website, blog, and podcast. In my interview with David, we discuss representation in Hollywood, the Hays Code, and all things queer in James Bond and action films in general. I highly recommend you check out License to Queer and David's work, as it's an incredibly important conversation that we need to be having in terms of films and the marketing of Hollywood. I want to say thank you to David for coming on as well. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with him, and I look forward to doing more of these in the future. I also want to apologize, as this is the first interview I've ever done for the podcast. I was a bit nervous bringing David on, so I apologize about the ums, the ahs, and the extended pauses. I'll get better at doing these, but I really appreciate you listening to this, and I hope you enjoy this new format that I'm taking on for Selling Secrets. But without further ado, let's get into the interview with David Lowbridge-Ellis from License to Queer. All right, so I'm here today with my guest, David Lowbridge-Ellis, who is the creator of the License to Queer website, as well as the License to Queer podcast. David, thank you very much for coming on to Selling Secrets. Really a pleasure to have you here.
It's my pleasure, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I guess tell us a little bit about yourself and what is License to Queer?
So I am approaching a significant birthday next year, beginning with a 4. And for most of those years, I have been, I haven't been an out gay man for most of those years. I have been a closeted gay man for most of those years, but I came out in my middle 20s while doing my day job as a teacher in mostly secondary schools, and I still work in education. And I belatedly started a project called License to Queer last April during the first COVID lockdown. It finally gave me the kick that I needed. Even though I was doing a lot of work, I thought I need something to just occupy my mind outside of work, and there wasn't much else to do. And the idea had been in my head for a very, very long time. I'd had this file saved on the computer, which was called Gay James Bond, for a long, long time. I don't think I've ever told this story, actually, going back this far. But I had that file, and every time I noted something in a Bond movie or a Bond book, or I read about something that had a queer connection, I wrote it down in that document. And I thought, one day I'm going to turn this into a book. It never happened. It was just sitting there on the computer all this time. But all that time, I was just getting really, really frustrated that I wasn't reading about these things in mainstream media about Bond. So I'd spotted these connections, but no one else seemed to have spotted these connections. So I thought, to hell with it. I'm going to actually start a website. I'm going to do a couple of what I've now now called Queer Reviews, where I look again at a Bond film or a Bond book and see it through what I call queer lenses and highlight those things, trying to write for as mainstream an audience as possible, because I don't just want people who identify as LGBTQ plus to read those, because I want other people to see Bond the way that I see the world of Bond. So that's how it all began, really, and it has grown significantly since last April. And the gratifying thing about it is that I've had lots of people, queer and non-queer, reach out to me to say, I've never really appreciated Bond in these terms. So even other queer people have never really seen Bond in this way, but it sort of has started snowballing a bit. And now I've got lots of, at least a dozen other people who write for the website who bring their different queer points of views. And I don't just, I'm a white gay man, so I'm always very acutely aware of my fairly privileged position in society, relatively speaking. But I do have lesbian contributors, bisexual contributors, trans contributors, non-binary contributors, and it's just really nice, to be perfectly honest. And I'm hoping it's kind of a force for positivity going out into the world.
That's incredible. I think positivity, especially in these conversations, is something that's the most important thing to have, and to educate people. A phenomenal story. I mean, I can relate totally to the whole coronavirus starting creating things. I mean, we had obviously the longest lockdowns in the world here in Melbourne. Yeah. So that's how I started sort of doing this. It gave me something to do and to talk about something I'm passionate about. So as much as I hate saying I'm grateful for the pandemic, I'm grateful that it's been able to have creators such as yourself have that opportunity to, have their voice and start thinking and creating content that's important to them. So I guess the question is, why James Bond?
I don't think there was really any choice in the matter in my mind. I love lots of pop culture stuff. Like, I also do a Star Wars podcast, although the Star Wars and Bond communities don't seem to be terribly compatible a lot of the time. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. I can see behind you, you've got some Batman paraphernalia from the 1960s. I'm obsessed with Batman as well. There's a Stormtrooper mug as well, and Darth Vader.
Avengers.
Lord of the Rings.
I've got it all.
Yeah. I love all of those things. I actually did my undergraduate dissertation about Batman comics. So even though my academic background is in linguistics and literature, and educational leadership and management as well, which doesn't sound as exciting, I know. But so even though my academic background is in that, I've always tried to bring my interests into my academic concerns as well.
Well, you have to, right?
Yeah. So, but I've sort of resisted doing it with James Bond, perhaps because James Bond was the first thing that I became obsessed with as a child, like the age of 6 or 7. I often say that I got into James Bond almost exactly at the same time that I realized I was gay. And I don't think those two events are linked. But being as they've both been a part of my life for the same amount of time, it would just seem really daft that I took over 3 decades to actually start making the connections explicit. So I just love James Bond, really, and almost like and I sometimes play around with this. I love James Bond almost to a worrying degree. Like, I will constantly map James Bond onto everyday life. And I mean constantly. Like, putting up the Christmas tree last weekend, singing "Do You Know How Christmas Trees Are Grown?" And that really awful song on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And even when I've never shared this one with anyone either as well, but when it's really silly everyday things like opening the glove compartment of the car to put something in, I imagine I'm locking a GPS encoder in there from Tomorrow Never Dies. I'm not.
Amazing.
It is actually slightly concerning, if I'm brutally honest, that I love James Bond to that extent.
To be honest, it's not concerning. It's quite comforting to know that there's people like me out there, because I can totally relate.
There was a brief period of my life, and I think it was in my early 20s. I've written about this on the website quite a lot. My approach to writing about Bond is autoethnographic, which is a posh academic term for kind of going back over what's happened to you. So it's like writing a personal history. And I did have quite a horrible time in my early 20s, around the time where I really couldn't deal with being gay, and it affected my mental health and that sort of thing. And weirdly enough, that was also the period where very brief period of a couple of years where I fell out of love with Bond. It was also, perhaps not coincidentally, around the release of Die Another Day. So I don't know if that affected things. And I've subsequently grown to admire Die Another Day. But yeah, so there was that period between 2002, between 2006, where for some of those years I did sort of fall out of love with it. And it was partly because I think, just to psychoanalyze myself for a moment, I think that I couldn't see where the queer representation was in Bond. And the project that I'm doing now is sort of trying to make sure that no one else goes through that same period of falling out of love with Bond. And quite a few of the people have said that at some point, there's a really good article that's just been published on the website by Kathleen Jowett, who's an Anglican a queer, but she defines herself as an Anglican queer Bond fan. So she's religious, she's bisexual, and she loves Bond. And her article is about how she was wrestling with those different parts of her identity, and that she didn't see herself in Bond, but then she didn't see herself in religion. And then eventually she's kind of managed to kind of reconcile the differences between all of those things and find the common ground. So yeah, apart from that couple of years, I've always been obsessed with James Bond.
Fantastic. And is it all of Bond? Do you gravitate towards, I guess, the films, the books? Is there a specific side of the fandom and the content that you tend to lean towards?
Like most people, I think it was the films that got me into it. But I did read, and I wrote an article quite early on in License to Queer's life about this. I did read Thunderball when I was 8 years old. It took me a long time because it's probably above the reading age of an 8-year-old. But I did read Thunderball, and I remember some raised eyebrows of my teacher at the time when I took it into school to carry on reading during form time. So yeah, I've loved the books, and I still love the books. In fact, I've got into the books even more over the years, and I've read each Fleming book multiple times. I've read at least 3/4 of the continuation novels. I've played the video game, so GoldenEye 007 on N64. You know, I've spent probably about 500 hours on that game with friends playing multiplayer. Certainly back in the day. And the only thing that I've really never gone near are things like James Bond Jr. I think I was a bit too old to get into that, but I know a lot of people, that was their first experience of Bond. How about yourself?
Geared towards my age group. So I'm late 20s now.
Right.
I first got into Bond with the same as you. I think it was the films, always seeing them at the video store back when video stores existed and we had VHS. I believe the first one I saw was either The Living Daylights or GoldenEye. I was only allowed to watch the PG rated ones. Young kid. I still wonder whether my parents were not exactly the most responsible for introducing me to it that young. And then I had a friend who had a Nintendo 64, so would spend weekends locked up in his rumpus room just playing the crap out of that. And very fortunate, my great uncle, he gave me his entire Fleming collection of books. So as a young kid, I was in primary school then, so I would have been, probably around 8 as well, I'd say. And, just handed basically a couple of first editions and all these, Fleming books. And I think I read OHMSS cover to cover in 2 days as a very young kid. So it's a very similar story to yours in terms of how I came to it. I guess this would lead into the conversation where you're talking about queer representation and not seeing yourself in James Bond. Why is queer representation, gender representation, not just in James Bond, but in film in general, an important thing for a young man growing up trying to find his way in the world?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It helps, popular culture helps people find their way. And for better or worse, Bond does provide a template for living in some regards, just as all forms of popular culture do. I've never been religious, which is, I know, where a lot of people find their script for life. I've never, growing up gay means that you don't see yourself in the culture around you. You don't see yourself in, most of your family's relationships. So you essentially don't know how to live. So where do you get that manual for life from? Because didn't get it from religion, didn't get it from family, didn't get it from school. So I suppose the only manual for life that I had was the pop culture I was consuming, and with very few exceptions, I just didn't see myself on screen or on the page. And even now, it's a lot easier now to find LGBTQ plus content, and I know we're going to get into that, but it's still not omnipresent. You still have to go looking for it, and a lot of those portrayals are not especially positive. So accurate representation of how queer life really is, its importance can't be overestimated, I don't think.
Oh, absolutely. Though, to be able to see yourself in the content that you're watching and to, I guess, relate to it is an important thing. And I guess that, as you said, with films, and especially older films, that was something that wasn't necessarily looked on positively towards, I'd say.
Absolutely.
In older films, obviously there was the whole I can't remember the name of it now. I believe it was I've just completely forgotten, the Hays censorship.
Oh yeah, the Hays Code,
and all of the things that went along in with that, and that had a big part in terms of what you're actually allowed to show on screen. But older Hollywood films did have, I guess, a bit of a habit of exploring their associations with sexual and gender identity as deviant or as criminal. A lot of queer people on screen were seen as the bad guys. I mean, you look at something like Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, or in the context of James Bond, Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd in Diamonds Are Forever, or even Pussy Galore. All the queer people in old Hollywood, at least, they came across as the bad guys. And how does that sit with you?
I always say, in the context of Wint and Kidd, which licensed queer readers and listeners will know, I have talked about at length and funnily enough, some of that, it's nice that some of my comments about Wint and Kidd have found their way into mainstream media sources as well. So a few journalists have asked me about those characters. So I'm not going to say too much about Wint and Kidd because we could be here
please do.
But Wint and Kidd, in my mind, are always, on balance, a positive representation, even with their faults. But you are right; they are the bad guys. And you mentioned, I love that you mentioned Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, because I love Hitchcock movies. And although I didn't grow up in a household which watched a lot of movies, besides Bond and the kind of family favourites that were always on TV, and we didn't go to the cinema very often, one of the things that really got me into cinema as a late teen was watching Hitchcock movies, because I think his technique is so conspicuous, and you can sort of see the moving pieces of a Hitchcock movie. And part of that is because they are slightly older movies, and nowadays filmmakers tend to hide things like single takes, like long single takes. So famously, Rope is one of those movies which is designed to look like a single take, which actually also happens in No Time to Die, funnily enough. It's just that they disguise the edits in that, the sequence where Craig goes up the tower shooting all of Safin's men and so forth.
So at the start of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So those techniques, which have sort of become mainstream, were obviously pioneered by people like Alfred Hitchcock. But one of the things that Alfred Hitchcock also pioneered was dealing with taboo subjects. And I have no doubt that he was dealing with those taboo subjects to kind of make the audience uncomfortable, but at least those subjects were being portrayed on screen. So you refer to the Hays Code, which I recommend everyone Googles the Hays Code and reads you can find a PDF of it a lot easily online. I've actually taught about the Hays Code to students in the past. And we've actually gone through it line by line about the sorts of things that you couldn't put on screen. And I can't actually remember the exact phrasing. The sexual perversion is in there somewhere alongside miscegenation. So you can't show people of two races getting romantically inclined, and which in hindsight is like, how the hell was this ever a thing? But what clever filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock managed to do was portray these subjects, not always unsympathetically, but having to sort of code them, and so it wasn't really obvious unless you were looking for it. Now, in hindsight, as an adult watching Hitchcock's Rope, I'm like, how does anyone know this is not a gay film? Because it is right there. It's about two college friends who share the same apartment, which only has one bedroom, and it's all in one set. So you get to see that bedroom quite a lot as the camera pans past. And the film opens with them having just finished strangling another attractive young man, hiding his body. And then basically all the guests arrive. They've stashed the body in the chest. And then James Stewart arrives, their professor, who is also quite obviously coded as gay. And then once you actually learn that the story that Hitchcock based this on was based on a real murder of two real gay men and their gay professor, you go, how did he get away with this? But I watched Rope when I was 17 or something, and I still didn't see it then. In fact, I was watching the behind-the-scenes documentary that came with it was a very early DVD that came with the DVD, and they started talking about Hitchcock really wanted to make a film about it, and it was Hollywood parlance for homosexuality. And I remember watching this with my parents in the room, and I was obviously closeted at the time and would be for another around 9 years. And I remember just going absolutely crimson in embarrassment, thinking, oh my God, they're watching me watch a documentary about why this film is so gay. And, you know, funny, last night I was watching, have you ever seen Nightmare on Elm Street 2?
A long time ago.
Yeah, I was watching, funnily enough, a documentary about this last night, and about how gay that film is, and that some people at the time didn't realise. And you look back at that film, and it's got such, you know, if anyone hasn't seen that film, it's got a clearly sexually repressed teenager who's trying to stop this thing bursting out of him, which is Freddy Krueger. And there's really like homoerotic elements, like whipping people with towels in a shower and all that sort of stuff. And it is amazing how much people used to have to code things, but they could still get them past the censors at the time. And one of the ways that you could make it, even I think one of the ways the censors allowed it was if the queer people were portrayed as being the villains, so the audience would not be endorsing what they would see on screen. But that doesn't mean it didn't stop queer viewers identifying with those characters. I always say that Winton Kid may be serial killers, but they do love each other, and you know, nobody's perfect.
Absolutely. I mean, having that portrayal as the villains or as that other, that must have an effect on you watching it, though. I mean, it's not like you're seeing yourself as the protagonist in those old films. It's always as that villain.
It does, and I don't want to get too depressing or anything, but I wrote about this perhaps most fully when I wrote about Quantum of Solace, because I've always seen Quantum of Solace as an allegory for queer shame and not feeling very good about yourself. And particularly as I saw Quantum of Solace around, like within 12 months of coming out, and it sort of reached its peak, and me feeling rubbish about myself got to a point where I just couldn't deal with it anymore. And I think probably watching that film at the same time, I identified with Bond in Quantum of Solace, because he doesn't like himself at all. He's drowning his sorrows, and it's not just it's not just his sorrows at Vesper, it's what he's becoming, and he's becoming this person he doesn't like. He's becoming the villain in Quantum of Solace. He's going around almost aimlessly killing people. He doesn't really know what his mission's about, but he's just going from one thing to another. He's living day by day, drinking 6 Vesper martinis, which is never a good idea, even if you're in a good frame of mind.
I think one would knock me over.
Exactly. Well, 2.5 is my limit. And yeah, it's you can identify with good characters when they are going through hell, but they usually come out through on the other side. Whereas, yeah, there were no real role models of that kind, whether queer or when I was growing up.
Which is I guess leading into the next question that I have for you is, now that we do have quite a lot more representation on screen, Hollywood has progressed since those days. The Hays Code is no longer. But what is, I guess, there's two sides of the coin. Obviously, it's fantastic that we do have more representation, but there are still very problematic representations of queer people on screen. Can you talk to a little bit more about, I guess, whilst it's good that we've got queer people on screen, how they're being portrayed may not necessarily always be in the perfect light still?
I've thought long and hard about this since you sent me the questions, and I've talked about it with my husband about it, actually. We were trying to think of mainstream media which does have positive portrayals, and we came up with a fairly short list, if I'm honest. Most of the positive portrayals are in quite adult certificated dramas, particularly TV dramas. Like, I don't know if it's got over there, but It's a Sin, which was on I think they're within the last 12 months here, which was a drama about gay people in the 1980s, which was written by Russell T Davies, who did great job at representation on Doctor Who in the mid-noughties here. So that's kind of the most positive portrayal I can think of, because it balanced the horror of AIDS with how joyful it actually was to be gay at that point. So that's probably the most positive portrayal I can think of. But those sorts of things tend to be slapped with, here it would be a 15 or an 18 certificate. So a broader audience wouldn't get access to those things. So then our thought process went to things like, Star Trek, where they had Captain Sulu appear to meet his husband and child at some point in Star Trek Beyond. Yep. And I know that caused some controversy. George Takei wasn't happy for various reasons. So it tends to be within sci-fi, you can sort of get away with it a bit more. That still doesn't excuse Star Wars Rise of Skywalker, which was really, really bad in terms of queer representation, I felt, because it was like this much heralded, essentially this, like, it's probably about 10 frames of film kiss between two of the women in the celebration at the end. And I know you have to start somewhere, but that's the problem with a lot of these things. They get a lot of publicity sometimes, and you go in with higher expectations. I think perhaps a parallel with this one is, if you think about No Time to Die and Q being he's saying he'll be here, and he's very obviously fussing with his hair and whatever. It's still coded to a degree, but it's very obvious that he's having a date with a man. Yeah. Whereas that didn't leak out beforehand, or it didn't when I'd seen the film. And as a result, it meant more because people hadn't pored over it and so forth. And I'm more than happy to talk about Q at length in a minute. But the other example that I just wanted to mention was, our conversation went to Disney. And I think we'd have only really made headway when, as I understand it, Disney is probably the biggest of the so-called studios nowadays. We'll have only really made it, and I did mention Star Wars already, which is now obviously under the Disney banner. But if you think about something like I think really positive. If I don't know if you've seen the Eternals.
I have. I saw it 2 days ago, so very fresh in mind.
And I love that film. I thought it was a very, very positive film. Like most Marvel movies, the ending could have been a bit better. But I thought on balance, it was a really, really good film. And I think that did it really well. What I noted, though, with that is that as for all of the marketing that I saw for that film didn't mention that one of the main characters was gay and was in a same-sex relationship. It probably was there in some of the articles written around it, but it wasn't there in the trailers. Even though you see that character, you don't see his husband and so forth. So that was kind of good because it was integral to the story. The story actually probably wouldn't have worked without that real human part at the center of it. So I thought, to be honest, that was by far for years really, that was by far the best representation of a same-sex relationship. And then, but the thing is, you give with one hand and you take away with the other. So I don't know if you saw Jungle Cruise as well by Disney.
I haven't seen it yet. I've heard mixed things, so it's sort of
it's a third of a brilliant film when it's in screwball comedy mode, like Bringing Up Baby. You know, that's another great example of a coded queer film. You know, Kathleen Hepburn and Cary Grant having a gay old time of it in the late 1930s screwball comedy, but directed by bisexual Howard Hawks. So, but when it's in that mode, the film is really good, and then it kind of deteriorates in the last third, definitely, and becomes Pirates of the Caribbean. But in that film, there is a character played by a straight man, which is a whole other discussion, but played by a straight man, Jack Whitehall, and he plays a character who is very obviously coded as gay, but he's in that sissy mold. So if you go back to older Hollywood films, the most palatable way of presenting a gay character who wasn't an out-and-out villain was to sissify them, which meant they behave with very effeminate, effete gestures, and therefore you completely desexualize the character. So it's almost like we'd taken a massive step back with Jungle Cruise, and there was an opportunity in that film as well to portray him in a same-sex relationship. It's so obvious that it should have happened at a particular moment in that film, and you go, why didn't they go there? And I suppose at the heart of all of this discussion is that question: why is Hollywood still so hesitant to go there? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on why you think that might be the case.
It's such a loaded question. Obviously, especially in Hollywood, there is the history of the things that went on with the Hays Code. I mean, we're only starting to get, colored people representation, people of various backgrounds in that sense. And with America, I think Europe, you tend to find there's a lot better representation when it comes to film as a broader stroke, because America is so heavily religious. And I feel that Hollywood still does have quite a lot of religious undertones in terms of the people who are pulling the strings, at least. And there is that hang up from there. And over in America in general, in the population as well, there is that very religious anti-gay propaganda that's still out there compared to a lot of other countries in the world where it has been a lot more accepted. And I think that's probably one of the reasons, at least, that I could see why Hollywood is so hesitant in showing, diverse relationships across the queer spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy with people of color, because I referred earlier to the Hays Code, that miscegenation used to not be able to be portrayed. I've got a couple of friends who live in America, in the state of Kentucky, which you might expect. There's a lot of people, a lot of their neighbors who are very conservative. This couple that I actually do the Star Wars podcast with the man in this couple. So and he's white and his wife is black, and they are still known in their town as the mixed race couple. They are. It is that unusual. And so for all Hollywood's positive portrayals of people, black and white people in relationships and other races as well, there is the reality that is still considered unusual in some parts of the USA. And a lot of people cite China because it's easy to blame someone else. A lot of people cite the large Chinese market as the reason why we don't get more diversity in film, particularly in terms of sexual orientation. I've been to China on holiday several times, and I've held my husband's hand walking down the streets of Shanghai. Admittedly, we've been in the kind of more cosmopolitan areas, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and so forth. I've walked down the street, and you do get stared at, quite a lot. But it's almost, I may be being a bit too positive here, but I almost feel like it's a sense of curiosity in a way, rather than out and out hostility. In fact, we were in Shanghai Disneyland because for all my problems with a lot of Disney's output, my husband is a massive Disney fan. We were in Shanghai Disneyland, and there's ride photos.
Yep.
Where we kissed on the Tron coaster, and when we got out of the ride, and they put the photos up, where you can buy the photos, there were loads of people around the screen who didn't see us, but they saw our photo of us kissing on the Tron coaster on this screen, taking photos of that picture. So loads of the Chinese clientele, you barely get any people in Shanghai Disneyland who aren't Chinese. So the Chinese clientele at the park were taking pictures. I always remember that because I remember thinking, maybe there is an appetite for portrayal of same-sex couples in the Chinese market because, China is the most populous country on earth. They're going to have the most queer people on earth as well.
Naturally.
And if they're not, because, that's the same across any population. So there is a market for that there. Like there is a market for it anyway. And for me, and I'm really interested to get your perspective on this, because obviously you're the expert on marketing in film. And I think there will become a tipping point where if people don't include queer characters in their media, as attitudes do gradually change, if people don't include queer people in their media, then actually they're going to be losing money because they aren't going to. That people aren't going to choose that form of media. There's so much media to choose from. And the way that Netflix does its categories and everything is algorithm driven, that if you don't include queer characters, then people are just going to go, this isn't for me. So it's a bit like when I was in my early 20s and thinking Bond isn't for me. I think it was a really smart move to out Q in No Time to Die, and for hats off to Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson for having a fight with the studio in Skyfall for making sure the line about what makes you think this is my first time actually made the final cut of the movie. Because without those, and I know some people have said that they're queer baiting and whatever, and there's an element of that, but also it does mean that a section of the audience, a sizable section of the audience, feel represented.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to be such an important thing that we have moving forward in terms of representation across the board, in terms of trans representation, queer representation. Without having those and without having those people to look at on screen, there is going to be huge portions of audiences who just don't relate, and they will still feel alienated by these franchises or films, whatever it is, because naturally we look for ourselves in content. So I totally agree with you. I don't like the idea of mandating it, because then that starts to talk about the whole ham-fisted approach that companies potentially like Disney are taking with some of their representation, which isn't maybe done the best way. It's not naturally put in like Q, as you said. I know Ben Whishaw himself is a gay man, and he, I'm pretty sure, pushed quite hard to have that included as well, because he wanted to see people like himself in the film. I think that's a really important thing to have it naturally told. Because if you start beating people over the head with it, it doesn't feel genuine, and it feels like that queer baiting, as you were saying, almost.
I think that's the end point. I think we'll declare victory when, and I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon, but we'll declare victory when you put a queer couple or, a queer person in whatever, form of relationship. And, we've got a long way to, if we're talking about two gay men, then that's a fairly achievable benchmark. If we're talking about someone in polyamorous relationships, or if we're talking about any form of transgender representation kind of being the norm and unremarked about, we've got a very long way to go for those things.
Big time.
But if you're talking about, what were you going to say?
The only trans representation that I can think of off the top of my head, the series Hit and Miss with, I think it's Chloe Sevigny. Where she plays a trans hit woman.
But then again, she's played by Chloe Sevigny. I think actually the one that springs to mind, I always think is, written and directed by a trans person, is Sense8. I don't know if you ever watched that.
I did, yes, on Netflix. Yep.
And I think the new Matrix movie, although it's not there in the marketing, obviously directed by a trans woman, Lana Wachowski, and there's quite a few gay men who have been cast in that movie.
Neil Patrick Harris.
And Jonathan Groff.
Yep.
So I hope that we've got some trans actors in that movie as well. I think that movie will, despite that it's very kind of mainstream marketing, I think it will have some interest. I mean, The Matrix, I agree. I think The Matrix is an incredibly queer movie anyway. And particularly if you see it through trans lenses in hindsight, because obviously Andy, and it was Andy and Larry Wachowski.
Larry,
they weren't out at that point. So, but in hindsight, you can sort of see that film as being made by trans filmmakers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole red pill, blue pill, choosing your path, all that sort of thing. It's you can definitely see it there. And I sincerely hope that Lana has put some things into the new Matrix film.
Oh, definitely.
Because it's such an important conversation to be having.
I was just sorry, I lost my thread slightly, as I always do when I go off on tangents. I was just briefly going to say, the end point really is when you have queer people and it is unremarked upon. So I've noticed, and maybe this is just a UK thing, but we are starting to get more adverts for even just like household products, like cleaning products and whatever, where it shows a same-sex couple. And they just included alongside all of the other couples.
Yep.
And I don't see that happening in film, because the economics of film are, that these are big undertakings usually, but big mainstream movie, and you can find it in independent film, obviously, but in big mainstream movies, that will be the point, I think, where we can sort of declare victory and go, okay, it's not a big deal anymore. It has, but I don't like the term normalize. I prefer the term usualize, because I don't like feeling abnormal. But it is normalized, usualized, and it's just unremarked upon. And in the meantime, people are going to get it wrong. Now, as much as I criticize Disney for what they did with Jungle Cruise, I'd much rather they go there than not go there, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And it comes back to Winton Kid. I'm really glad that 50 years ago, the actors playing Winton Kid really just committed to that role, because on the page it could have, that could have gone so wrong. But particularly Bruce Glover, who's been interviewed recently, actually, in an article that I contributed to as well, by a journalist called Adam Bloodworth. They were both interviewed. Putter Smith and Bruce Glover were both interviewed, but Bruce Glover has said many times he just went for it. He was just like, okay, I am in love with this person, and this person is a man, and I'm just going to completely commit to this role. And I think sometimes actors' performances make up for any negative representation that appears on the page.
Definitely. I think that's a really good way to put it. And yeah, that the whole representation that, I mean, they've spoken about since has just been phenomenal. I still find it interesting that we don't necessarily have representation more broadly in action films in general. Obviously, it's starting to filter across, but for the most part, at least, especially when it comes to queer stories, not necessarily just side characters or characters in the films, say like Eternals, we don't necessarily have queer stories in action films or in the big drama, the big, Hollywood blockbusters. We see it in the romantic films, the comedies, the LGBTIQ plus, the rights dramas. We see a lot of representation and stories about that through that, but we don't have the same level in action films. Or is it because simply action films have had that heteronormative lens cast over them for so long? Do you see Hollywood, hopefully we get that soon, but do you see Hollywood moving in the right direction to start having those conversations more broadly in the story sense?
I think what it will take to change is a openly queer filmmaker who has the financial clout. Like, if Chris Nolan was gay, we would have had it by now.
Yeah,
we would have had a action movie where the two principal characters, men or women, would have had some kind of romantic relationship. I mean, he has snuck in a few queer-coded characters in his movies, most memorably Tom Hardy in Inception.
Yep.
Where he goes, "One mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling," when he hands him the giant grenade launcher. Jason Gordon-Levitt. I love that moment, but it is a moment. And there have been a few other filmmakers like Lee Daniels. He's a gay man. He said he really wanted to do an action movie where the hero just happened to be gay. I think it is a problem. You mentioned religion earlier on, but I'm not religious at all, and I'm not going to blame religion. I'm going to blame the people who have misapplied religion over the centuries, but particularly in a Christian culture, like we both belong to. That's the problem, really. So I'm not going to blame Christianity. I'm going to blame, because I'm always a fan of the idea that Jesus would be marching in a gay pride parade, spreading love.
Oh, he would, 100%.
But it's the way that's been misapplied. So if you go back to, the action movies arguably go back to Greek myth, or perhaps even before Greek myth. And funnily enough, I've been writing about this morning in the context of No Time to Die, because one of my arguments, spoiler alert, for the piece that eventually I will publish on No Time to Die, is that it owes an awful lot to Greek myth, and it taps into that more explicitly than any other Bond film ever has done before, even though it's always been there. And in Greek myth, people thought nothing of a very muscular, heroic alpha male character also having sex with men. So Hercules, for instance, who is the character invoked explicitly in No Time to Die, is, he's famous for having as many male lovers, if not more, as female lovers. So something went wrong in the last 2,000 years. And the thing that went wrong was people, I think it comes, and I know that LGBT conflates sexual orientation and gender, and it really shouldn't. But I think that's what's happening here. I think it's about gender expectations and gender norms that's the problem, as much as, if not more than, sexual orientation. So it is this idea that you can't be a manly man who will save the day in our cultures if you happen to be more attracted to other men. And it's that idea that we need to break apart, which actually is misogyny, essentially. So it's that rigidly defined gender roles of both men. Sexism cuts both ways, and obviously women have had the far rawer deal in recent history, if not all of human history. But men also get a raw deal out of sexism, because we feel compelled to subscribe to those rigidly defined gender norms. And I think it's that more than sexual orientation, which is stopping cinema from representing certainly a same-sex male couple from being together. And you've got the whole misogyny about action cinema in general. You don't get many women leading action movies compared with men. That is improving slightly, and then you add the dimension of a woman who's more into other women, and that makes it an even bigger hurdle to get over.
Yeah.
So I think, in my experience, even people who can kind of deal with me and my husband existing, which is helpful because we do, two gay men, they find it more difficult when you introduce any form of gender debate into the discussion, which is where we are as not just in our cultures, but lots of cultures, which is where we are with trans representation at the moment, isn't it? People just can't get their heads around any form of non-binary conception of gender. I think that's at the root of it anyway.
Absolutely, definitely. And as you said, it definitely is starting to normalize that female relationship a little bit more, obviously, where we're seeing shows like Killing Eve, which are, they started out a bit coded, but they're now starting to be a bit more overt in terms of the way they represent the relationship between those two characters. So
it's interesting you say Killing Eve, because obviously that was written by Phoebe Waller-Bridge.
Correct.
Who is adapted from... so the novels were written by a man, and then the series was adapted by Phoebe Waller-Bridge for the screen. Yeah. And I've seen similar forms of, I don't know if you call it soft misogyny or whatever, when they're talking... Even people who are talking about Phoebe Waller-Bridge it's good that she was brought on as a writer for No Time to Die. And a lot of people saying, oh, I can tell this is a Phoebe Waller-Bridge scene because she's writing as a woman. No, and the assumption is that she's written for the female characters. So I was delighted when, in the making of book for No Time to Die, it's pretty much confirmed by Kerry Fukunaga that one of the scenes that Phoebe Waller-Bridge is really responsible for. And when I first saw No Time to Die, I was like, oh God, this is such a Phoebe Waller-Bridge scene, because it is absolutely kind of that weird kind of mixture of awkward and hilarious and menacing, which I've seen her do so many times before. And I mean all of this in a very positive sense, of course. But the scene where Bond faces off against Blofeld, for me, has Phoebe Waller-Bridge's fingerprints all over it.
Absolutely.
And she's writing a sequence between two men. Now, no one
Thank you.
No one really says the opposite. So no one really says that men shouldn't write a scene between two women. Now, I dare say there are some very badly written scenes between women written by men. But, Killing Eve was originally written by a man in a book, and yet the story mostly concerns women. You put it the other way around, and you bring women into a so-called men's sphere, and people lose their minds about it. Or they go very reductively and say, you can only write for women. I mean, it's only recently come to light how much of a contribution she had, but we wouldn't have Bond nowadays without a woman writer. So Johanna Harwood is responsible for writing, essentially. It's always difficult to kind of tease apart who wrote what in a script, obviously, and they purposely tried to confuse it for contractual and financial reasons. But it's pretty much confirmed now that Johanna Harwood, who was one of the credited writers on Dr. No, and also did some of the writing on From Russia with Love, took what some of them... She wrote the first draft. Some men came on board and practically ruined it by making James Bond kind of your very macho, hard-boiled sort of detective, a more of a kind of American action hero figure. She got the script back, and Harry Saltzman said, you do what you want with this. And she went back to Fleming's books and put more of the character from Fleming's books, which other people had considered too feminine, about the character. So the character we end up with on screen, yes, you can credit it to Terence Young, Sean Connery, and so forth, but most of the things which we kind of consider iconic about Bond were in the Johanna Harwood draft of that script. So,
and she got paid less for writing
oh, she
it.
got paid an
Yeah,
absolute pittance because she was already on Harry Saltzman's staff, which is no excuse whatsoever. But
absolutely.
we wouldn't have, and that's one of the brilliant ironies about Bond. I always think that a lot of people say that he's the ultimate man, he's this alpha male character. And actually, he's got a lot of feminine qualities, stereotypically feminine qualities. And part of that is because it was there in Fleming and that was translated to the screen by a woman.
And you speak about that in your podcast. Sorry, I was re-listening to the Dr. No one actually the other day,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you speak about the feminine qualities of being well dressed and all that sort of thing. You associate that with James Bond being a gentleman.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily associate that with the feminine qualities which we would talk negatively about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my podcast, obviously, I'll move on from sort of where we're at now, but my podcast is obviously a little bit more focused on the marketing since that's what I do for a living. How do we bring more queer fans to? Let's talk about James Bond because that's your specialty, your what you're so passionate about. How do we bring more queer fans to James Bond? I mean, obviously, one of the things that I always think about with the character, he's a bloody spy. He's going to go out there and do whatever he needs to do to get the job done. Now, whether that's, he has to seduce a man because there are male spies out there who are gay. How do we bring more queer fans to the Bond franchise and, really elevate it to the next level?
It is a really tricky one because whenever you introduce a queer character, you're always going to get some people who are offended by the portrayal because queer people are, we aren't a homogenous group. We are quite different. Even if I just think about gay men, for instance, there are, the gay men that I know personally, you would perhaps put on various different spectrums from being quite stereotypically feminine, and then you've got more stereotypically masculine, and I always think I'm kind of somewhere in between and capable of going to one extreme or the other depending on the social situation, which is really queer when you stop to think about it. So the fact that we have to adapt, it's almost like we were born to be spies because we have to disguise who we are. And this is one of the things that has been going around in my head for all these years, that spying is an inherently queer profession. I'm not the only person who thinks that. There's quite a lot of literature that says that. And even if you look at the modern MI6, the current M, I've just forgotten his name, it's Richard something. The current M is actually on Twitter, by the way. So if you don't follow M on Twitter, he's definitely worth following. And obviously he doesn't share any state secrets, but what he does is he's obvious. It's mostly a recruitment tool, I think, even though it's his personal Twitter account. But he's quite vocal on that MI6 is a diverse place to look in. They always put the transgender flag up at various points of the year, the other pride flags as well. So I think Bond really should start reflecting the real MI6 as well as kind of whatever version we have in our heads. If I think about the problems of representation of people who've tried to do this, I don't know if you've seen the animated series on Netflix, which is called Q-Force, which is probably the closest thing to that. So apart from one person, a token straight guy, played by David Harbour, who actually plays Gregory. I've just forgotten his surname, but he's in Quantum of Solace. David Harbour's a great queer ally. So everyone else in the show is queer, apart from the evil boss person as well. So if for once you've actually got a cast of mostly, and I know it's animated, but mostly queer characters voiced by, and they look like them as well, voiced by queer people, and they are spies, and it draws heavily on James Bond, and it works. There are people online who hate it, including queer people who say it is too stereotypical. and that some of the jokes are really out of date. That queer teenagers now wouldn't relate to some of the gags and whatever. So it's clearly aimed at people of my age who kind of get the references. But on balance, I believe that to be one of the best forms of queer spy representation on screen. I would love to see that done in a Bond context. I know that the Broccolis are adamant they're never going to do a Bond TV series, that it's just a cinematic franchise. But I've been crying out for, my husband kind of sometimes, and I over dinner sometimes plot out what the storylines of this might be. We've imagined like a series called the Double O's, where you have the different part in Double O's, which are quite a diverse bunch of spies. So you've got the token straight guy who's Bond, although that's up for debate, obviously. And you've got a transgender double O. You've got a lesbian double O. You've got if Bond isn't fitting into the category bisexual, then you've got a bisexual double O, and so forth. And obviously it goes without saying that you have people of color in there, because that's what real life is like, not how Hollywood represents it. There is a book series which is coming out next year, which you may have seen. So it's been officially licensed by Ian Fleming's estate, which is going to be a 3-book series about the Double O's. So I'd be really interested to see. I'm following the author on Twitter and Instagram, actually, just to sort of keep tabs on that one, really, because I think it would be a real missed opportunity if she didn't bring in some more diversity in that crew.
Absolutely. I think I'd love to see. Have you seen? Obviously, you're British, so you would have seen the BBC series Spooks.
Yeah, you know what? I've only ever seen one episode of Spooks, and it was when someone got their head in a deep fat fryer, and I was like, okay, this is a bit gory for me. So even though I can watch really gory horror movies and things, there are some things which just kind of set me off. So I know of it though. Yeah.
I'll give you a bit of background then. Like that's like season 1. That's one of the very early episodes where the characters have gone undercover. And they've infiltrated someone. She gets killed basically because they're trying to torture her to make him give up the information. But that series, I think, could be brought back because it's about MI5 spies. You had people of color, you had women, all these different things. You could bring that back now. Bring that back for, I think it ran for 10 seasons and a film, so bring it back for an 11th season. And you could really mine that for, deep and where you are having those discussions, because in that sort of Bond world, it's, as you said, it's real people. It's gonna happen and have those conversations.
And it has happened. I mean, even Fleming writes about it in From Russia with Love. So I didn't realize kind of how much that story relies on the audience at the time being really familiar with the gay sex spy scandals of the time period to really understand where that book is coming from. So I won't go over it all because I ended up writing about 8,000 words about this when I did my queer review of From Russia with Love. But essentially, there is actually a discussion between Bond and someone who's a bit of a relic from the Second World War, they're having a discussion, and Bond's actually defending homosexuals in that discussion. But this other guy is basically saying homosexuals are security risks, which they were at the time. So there was, you may have heard of the Cambridge spies, people who were friends at university, most of whom were queer. And they were essentially, they worked their way up. A couple of them worked their way up into the highest echelons of the Secret Service. One even became head of MI5. And he was a Russian spy. And he was queer. And they defected. And there were other spies, like there was a famous one called John Vassell, who was actually blackmailed. He was photographed naked on a bed with some men. It was a honey trap that the KGB set up. and he was blackmailed into selling secrets as well. So gay spies used to be, everyone knew that spying was quite a queer profession, and Fleming deals with that. So I don't know why it hasn't been dealt with in Bond. Perhaps because in that context, the spies were baddies; they were selling secrets. But one of the reasons, and this is also a little known thing about one of the reasons why homosexuality got decriminalised here in the UK, was because they were a security threat. So the idea was, we'll decriminalise homosexuality because then you can't blackmail somebody. So after 1967, when homosexuality was partly decriminalised, people of certain ages, why haven't we had a story where, I suppose you wouldn't want the blackmail story to happen, but as you say, you can imagine a spy having to use whatever was at their disposal to be able to get the job done.
Definitely. The James Bond franchise, where we've spoken about queer representation. Where would you like to see it taken in the future, outside of what we've already discussed?
I would ideally like Bond to embrace the bisexuality, which I think is it's inherent in the character, if I'm honest. I think it has always been there since the beginning. You don't have to read that much between the lines of Fleming's books to find it. And I certainly think the way that Sean Connery played Bond right from the outset, it has invited those interpretations. I am very, very wary, of course, of using the term bisexual, because although I know lots of people who identify as bisexual, there are lots of people, probably an even greater proportion of many societies, who don't use that term. But, so our health service here in the UK, the NHS, use the term men who have sex with men rather than bisexual, because bisexual is an identity, whereas men who have sex with men is the reality for a lot of people. So a lot of straight identifying men in marriages to women will still have sex with men. So I'm not saying that Bond has to do the whole flag waving, I'm bisexual, but if the situation arose, and there must be situations where this would arise, where you hope to be able to seduce the enemy by flirting with them. And I think Daniel Craig does this a lot, actually. He's basically flirting with everybody in his movies. It just never, apart from with Q, where it almost tips over a few times. And I know people have written slash fiction about this, take it to the next level. But it's there. And there is enough there, really. I'd like to see him actually follow through on screen, because you get the impression it's happened off screen, but I would like it to happen off screen. The thing for me, even though I identify as gay, I never shut myself down to possibilities. So if there was a woman, and my husband and I talk about this a lot, but even if there was a woman that, for some, I suddenly found that woman attractive, I hope I wouldn't be absolutely terrified of that prospect. And occasionally, we will see a woman on screen, for instance, or in real life, and we go, my God, they are very attractive. And I actually just think it's really, really sad that people shut down those possibilities. So it would be nice, because Bond opens up so many possibilities, it would actually be nice to just take it to that next level. I'm not saying we want a gay James Bond. That would sort of be fun. And I'm funny enough writing another article about this at the moment, because there is a sort of parody film which sort of does imagine what that's like. But
really?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, so it's actually, you can actually watch it on Amazon, and you can get the DVD. It's called Jason Bend, which sounds like it is an out-and-out spoof, but it actually imagines what a gay James Bond character would be like, and it plays it despite what I've just said about the title, and the names are hilarious. I won't spoil anything else, but there is a villain character in the sort of Xenia Onatopp mode who has a hilariously awful name. So it's got those elements which you already have in Bond. But actually, in terms of the gay representation, it plays it straight in the sense that it's not making fun of him being a gay James Bond. He's actually just a very capable 00 agent. It's like borderline copyright infringement at times because he's 009 and he drives an Aston Martin and that kind of thing. But it does play, and you watch that even for 10 minutes and you go, actually, it probably wouldn't be too much of a stretch to have a gay James Bond. It sort of fits. Now, I'm not saying we need that because I think it would be really powerful to have. I think that would almost shut down possibilities to make him just gay. But I think he does need to be. I want a pansexual Bond, basically. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree completely with you. I think that's definitely the way it needs to go and progress.
Yeah.
I mean, as you said, Daniel Craig's flirting with everyone. What makes you think this is my first time?
Exactly.
Come on. That's just pitch perfect in every sense of the
Which
way.
is, to be honest, how I think we should aim to be as a society. I think labels are comforting for some people because it helps put things in a box, and that includes people who own that label. So sometimes it is really helpful for me to use a gay label. I started this podcast saying I'm a gay man, rather than saying anything else about me, because that I do see that as an important part of my identity. But at the same time, I'm not going to allow that label to shut down possibilities.
And that doesn't define who you are as a person. And you said it earlier as well, not every single queer person in the world can be lumped into one category.
No.
We're all individuals. And obviously I'm a straight white man. Whilst my last name is gay, and
we were talking about this before we started, weren't we?
I mean,
you were saying, I don't want to dredge up the childhood trauma too much. Which is what I spend most of my time doing on Licensed Queer. But I always say when I'm doing training on this, and I do quite a bit of this, that you don't have to be gay to be homophobically bullied or experience homophobia, because actually probably about 10% of people are gay. So there's 90% of people probably encounter homophobia at some point.
Big time. So I'll give you a bit of background on myself. So full name's Joshua Anthony Gay. My middle name's named after my dad. Say it out loud. It's Josh, you are a gay. So I copped a lot of shit growing up as a kid, you're beaten up at primary school simply because of my name. And that it's used as a derogatory term. We had this conversation off air where it's not necessarily used against, gay people as a slur. It's used against straight people to demasculize straight people because it's an insult to you. So, I had to grow a thick skin quickly because that was just pounded into me. And I've used a bit of humor now, obviously, with my last name. So Josh, you are a gay. My dad's Anthony. My dad was in the Navy and he worked on submarines. So he was a gay sailor in a submarine full of seamen. My uncle, his brother, is Richard Gay, Dick Gay. My fiance, her last name's Pretty. If we hyphenated our last name, it'd be Pretty Gay. So I have heard every freaking joke under the sun when it comes to
I think you should own it. When you get married, I think you should just own it.
Yeah. I've and I've had this conversation, with my fiance of, what are we going to do for our kids? And I've been straight up with her. I'd be happy to take her last name. I don't think that we have to, obviously do the heteronormative thing where the woman takes the man's last name.
That's very nice.
But I grew up I went to a public school for primary school. So that's up until I was about the age of around 10, I think you finished primary school here. And then, went to a semi-private religious school. And like you, I'm not a religious person at all. If anything, going to a religious school made me...
Put you off.
It put me off. It made me more of an atheist and I have got nothing against religious people. As you said, unless they use religion as a tool to marginalize other people. And that's something that was prevalent in the school that I went to the point where I wanted to have, so in year 12, we would have, our nicknames on our jumpers. It was sort of it's our final year. We're going to have a bit of fun with it. And all my friends are putting on quite lewd last names, and I wanted to have straight. Just taking the piss out of my last name, I wanted to have straight. They wouldn't let me have that. So I turned around to them and I said, okay, well, I'll have gay then. And the conversation was very uncomfortable with these teachers. Like, I had gay friends at school, and we would have these really deep debates with teachers who were saying, you are wrong. You're not the right thing. And I think there's been at least 2 teachers fired from that school for coming out as gay. And like one was a woman, one was a man, and this is very recent. We're talking in the last.
Well, I was going to say, if you're in your 20s, when was
I'm 27. This? I'm 27. I graduated in 2011. So I've been out of school this year for 10 years. So these conversations are still happening, and religion is still being used as a tool against gay people in a negative. And I think that's why I look at it in that lens as well, because life experience, that's what you do. And I want to do everything that I can to help my friends and help people not feel that way, because I'm not a gay man, but I don't like to say I've had that experience, but I have had their experience used against me in a negative way, and I want to do everything.
What it's like to be on the receiving end.
I want to be an ally. I want to make these conversations, as you said, not normalized but usualized, because at the end of the day, we're people. We can't help who we love and who we're attracted to, and that's why I want to have people like yourself on the show, where we can have these open conversations about the things that we love so much and why it's so important to have it. So in saying that,
I can see how passionate you are. Absolutely.
I'm getting worked up about it.
No, and I think it's worth getting worked up about. I really do. And I'm, thank you for sharing that with me, because I know it can't be pleasant to go back over those memories. But one thing I did note, those memories are really vivid for you. So you remember.
Angry. It makes me really. I feel free to swear on this show, by the way. It makes me really fucking angry, especially having my year 12. My year 12. What do you call it? Your reunion was supposed to be this year. I mean, it's been pushed back now, obviously, due to the pandemic. But I am making a point of wearing, a gay pride shirt to the school, and just waving a big middle finger at them, because fuck them.
I feel the same. I feel that same. Even as I mentioned earlier, apart from being gay, I'm pretty privileged. I was never, my parents were never like massively well off or whatever, but, financially comfortable for most of my life. And, I'm a white man. I'm, apart from being red haired, which is another excuse for people to call it hello. We didn't talk about it, but for those listening, we are both gingers. So
only
that's another reason.
Can call a ginger.
Oh yeah,
as,
totally.
Tim mentioned.
Otherwise it's gingerist. But yeah, it's just it's a whole well of pain, isn't it? Just thinking about that stuff that happens in childhood, and I'm just really sad that it's still happening in 2011. So I think sometimes I do live in a bit of a bubble. That I work with lots of different schools and people from across the country and sometimes internationally. And that just reminds me that actually we still have an awful long way to go. It's people like yourself as allies who really, let's be honest, are going to make that change happen, because, allies are the majority of a population by most estimations, and they're the people who are going to make that change, and people getting to know each other. But I feel a sense of responsibility to people who are more marginalized. So I get very, like you, get really emotional about things that have happened to you and, people, and those injustices. At the moment, here in the UK, I wrote an article about this fairly recently. It's transgender people who are just not being understood or listened to in the right way.
Same
although,
over here.
although I identify as cisgender, although I don't feel an especially strong sense of gender, but if I, and I've written about that quite a lot, am I male? Am I female? I think I'm a man, but because I do identify as cisgender, I see it as my responsibility to stand up for people who don't. But not everyone feels that for some reason. I don't know why. I always think being part of a minority group myself means that I have an affinity with people who are in other minority groups. But then again, there are gay people who, for some reason, are spectacularly racist and transphobic. And I'm just like, why don't you get this? You're part of a marginalized group. Why don't you understand what is happening here? I just don't get it.
It's like over in Australia here at the minute, especially. It's a big thing in our political news. They're trying to push a bill through the parliament that's they call it a religious discrimination bill, and so our prime minister at the minute, it's very Pentecostal. He's best mates with the guy that runs Hillsong, all that sort of stuff. And the whole idea of this bill is so that religious people aren't discriminated against for basically woke culture, whatever the hell woke culture, PC, whatever, that shit is, right? They're trying to push this through. The underlying horrific nature of this bill is that it will allow these religious people to discriminate against minorities in the workplace. So gay people, transgender people, it will allow them to, in schools, it will give them the freedom to marginalize kids. And it is something that we need to fight against.
That is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, because it's still something that's happening right now. It's something we need to fight to the bitter end about, because people be marginalized even more so if these sort of laws are passed through the parliament.
I was not aware of most of that, and I feel especially now even more kind of galvanized into even my humble contributions to try and get more of these discussions going, because last time I checked the analytics on the website, License to Queer, I think, is read mostly by people in the UK, the USA, Australia, and I think fourth is Germany. So perhaps unsurprisingly, three predominantly English-speaking countries first. But I know there's an international audience, and there's quite a few of those. There's again, last time I checked, there were about 82 countries which read License to Queer, and some of those countries are actually countries where being gay is illegal.
Yep.
But then
places
we've
like
got
Russia.
other countries, United Arab Emirates, Qatar. So, but at the same time, there's countries like ours where our rights are constantly having to be defended, and that's why I get frustrated, if I'm honest, with the pace of change in society, and particularly the representation on screen. And I know that representation on screen isn't everything, because there are systemic inequalities, like I can't believe it that in Australia teachers can still be fired for being out as gay. That absolutely terrifies me. I mean, although that has only not been the case for 18 years in this country, I started teaching in schools the year that changed. So that was kind of fortunate in a way, because I've been out for most of my teaching career, and that is protected in law. So I didn't know that wasn't a thing in Australia.
We've only had gay marriage in very recent memory. It's only been 5-6 years since we've had gay marriage legalized in Australia, and in the vote that we had against it, the Prime Minister at the time, his daughter's gay, and he voted against gay marriage in Australia.
Oh,
so it's we're a long way behind Europe and the UK. So there's a lot of work to go.
You say that it's only been people don't remember this. They just assume it's been around forever. It was 2014 in this country when same-sex marriage became possible. I know civil partnerships existed for 10. It's only recent history, and I'm not going to say, oh, a lot has changed in such a short space of time, because actually I think the media distorts that quite a lot sometimes. So for all those, for the few positive portrayals that we do have on screen, the reality behind it is it often doesn't match what's on the screen. Sometimes it's actually kind of ahead of social change. Sometimes it's behind social change. It's a tricky one.
Absolutely. And I think the more positive change that we have and the more positive representation we have on screen, especially in big franchises like James Bond, will only help move the conversation forward. So I think we'll end on that. We'll end on a positive note. I know I was getting a very, very passionate and riled up.
I love your passion, Josh.
I want to end on a positive note, though, because everything I try and do in life is, bring positivity, and my motto in life is positivity always wins. So I just want to thank you again for coming on, David. Where can we find License to Queer, and where can we find you on social media, and give you the biggest plug possible?
Oh, okay. So License to Queer is spelt the same with 2 C's, the British English way.
The correct English way.
Well, I'm not going to get into that debate, but I do get passionate about that one as well. So License to Queer is, if you put it into Google, it's in fact, if you put James Bond Queer into Google, it's the first thing that comes up, because there is still very little out there apart from on License to Queer written about James Bond from a queer point of view. So the website's there. There's currently about 200,000 words worth of material on the website, not just written by me, but other people. I'm working my way through each of the James Bond films. As I say, I'm working on No Time to Die at the moment. This is the first time I've written one, obviously, where the film has only just come out. So I'm doing it, striking while the iron's hot on that one. And they're all, but after that, I think I've got 9 of them to do. So eventually I'm going to say this here and now. I'm going to commit to my original plan, which is to eventually put these in some form of book. So it will be out there. I don't know how long it's going to take me, though, because every time I embark upon one of these queer reviews, I think, oh, it'll only be a couple of thousand words. 8,000 words later. So and they keep getting longer and longer and longer, and some of them require quite a lot of research. But you've got about 2/3 of the movies on there at the moment, just under. And I'm working on the others, but in between times there are shorter pieces, including pieces by other people. As I say, across the whole LGBTQ plus spectrum, there's a search facility on there. If you want to type in a particular identity or a particular Bond film or a particular character, I try to make everything really tagged so you can find the content you want, because it is a bit of it is quite expansive. There's also, if you're into cocktails, I don't know if you're into cocktails, Josh.
Big time.
Yeah,
big time. I'm a functional alcoholic,
like
as all
James
Australian.
So there are, I'm sure it's more than 30 cocktail recipes. So they're nearly all my own creations when I've been dabbling around in the spirits cabinet. So you can find those on there. And of course, I'm very active on social media. I try to do at least one post a day on Instagram and or Twitter, and usually both. So you can find me on there. And I'm more than happy to talk to anybody about any of these things. And if anyone out there, whether they're queer or not queer, because there are a couple of articles, in fact, I'm really excited about a new one as well, that someone's written who's an ally like yourself. So if allies want to write for the website and bring their points of view, then that's great as well. So please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Absolutely. And lastly, are there any other queer creators who you want to shine a spotlight on in the James Bond community, I guess?
I'm going to have to, obviously, I do owe something of a debt to Mark O'Connell, who... he was the first ever thing that I read, his book Catching Bullets, which was the first ever thing that I read were written by a queer Bond fan. So that book kind of made me think, oh, one day I could write my own thing about being a queer Bond fan. Obviously there are I think he's probably the biggest Bond YouTuber outside of David Zaritsky, but Calvin Dyson, who is, he's got his YouTube channel, and I know that he doesn't. That those writers don't tend to focus squarely on the queer point of view, but in a sense, just them existing and not being that shy about talking about their sexual orientation sort of makes it more acceptable in a sense. I know they're two white gay guys, so I do want to do some shout outs to the people who write for License to Queer. I see I'm scared now I might miss somebody out, but there are, so I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do the list of names. Just suffice to say that all of the contributors to License to Queer so far, I love them all dearly, and I always really enjoy seeing their points of view. So yeah, I'm not going to name them. People will have to discover them by themselves on the website.
That's okay. And I will put links to License to Queer, both the website, your podcast, and your social media, all in the notes on this podcast as well.
Yeah.
Once again, David Lowbridge Ellis from License to Queer, thank you very much for being on Selling Secrets. I look forward to reading that book when you get around to putting it out.
Give me a few years.
In the meantime, I will definitely be reading more on the blog. And when you put out more episodes of the podcast, we'll be one of your first listeners. But thank you again for coming on.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Josh.
So there we go. That was my interview with David Lowbridge Ellis from License to Queer. All the links to License to Queer, as well as the other creators David mentioned, will be in the notes of this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please leave us a positive like or review on Apple Podcasts. And you can follow me, Josh Gay, on Instagram at 007Oz, which is 007AUS. And you can follow Selling Secrets on Instagram as well, at Selling Secrets Pod. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you in our next one.